incision in his neck. Dr. Charles Baxter was standing on the other side and was going to help from that side. And I was standing at the president's head and was going to lean over and hold the retractor. As I got into that position, I looked down at the back of the president's head, and I was about that far, maybe 18 inches above his head. And I immediately was confronted by a huge wound right about where I'm placing my hand. And I asked Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter, I said, my God, have you seen the back of his head yet? And they said, we haven't had time to look at that. And I said, well, he's got a wound in the back, right side of the back of his head, about 5 inches in diameter, that has blown out also the back half of the right cerebral hemisphere, because I could look down inside the skull. And as I stood there, right after I said that, the right half of his cerebellar hemisphere trickled out onto the gurney. The reason I'm kind of being a little gross in describing that, I'm trying to locate the wound was way in the back of the head, not like some of the official versions show kind of up on the top of the head, as if the bullet might have been fired from above, which is sort of the official Warren Commission version of the nature of that bullet wound, rather than being so far back in the back of the head, where it would have come, as I'll comment about later, from the picket fence on a grassy knoll rather than from the 6th floor of the school book depository. So there we were, and obviously this was an unsurvivable injury. And nevertheless, they had started this exploration in his neck, and they quickly completed that. And as they did, Dr. Kemp Clark, who was our neurosurgery professor, had come into the room right after everybody else did, and was standing by an electrocardiographic monitor that had been attached to the president when he came into Trauma Room 1. And Dr. Clark was looking at that monitor, and just as they finished this exploration of the president's neck, Dr. Clark said to Dr. Perry, he said, Mac, you can stop now because he's gone. And Dr. Clark noticed that the electrocardiogram had just straight line. When the president came in, despite this massive wound, he was making agonal attempts to breathe, gasping attempts to breathe, and had excellent cardiac activity. But now, at this point, just at the end of this exploration, the cardiac activity had stopped. And so Dr. Perry made 1 or 2 closed chest massages on the president, and Dr. Clark, our neurosurgery professor, said, Mac, with that brain injury, I think we better stop. And so he did, and he was then pronounced dead. With that, the large crowd of people that had accumulated in Trauma Room 1 by that time surged out of the room, but Dr. Baxter and I were sort of caught between that crowd that was surging out of the room and pushed the gurney that the president was lying on against the wall of Trauma Room 1, and caught Dr. Baxter and myself between the gurney and the wall of the room. So we had to stand there while the rest of the crowd surged out of Trauma Room 1. Then as the room emptied out, we began to push the gurney away so we could walk out ourselves. But before we could do that, the door to Trauma Room 1 came open again, and a priest came in. We later found out that this was Father Huber. Father Huber had been called to administer last rites to the president if he should so need them, and everybody knew that he probably would need them. And Father Huber came in again. We would have had to push him out of the way to get out of the room. So we just stood against the wall of Trauma Room 1 again, Dr. Baxter and I. We felt that we were out of place being there witnessing the president's last rites, but nevertheless we couldn't conveniently get out, so we were forced to stand there. And we were standing probably about as far from where I'm now to the edge of the lectern, next to President Kennedy's head, as Father Huber leaned over to him, and all I could hear him say into the president's left ear as he leaned over him, Father Huber said, "If thou livest," and that's all I could hear, and everything else he said in a very low voice, and completed that. And just as he was completing it, the door to Trauma Room 1 came open again, and Mrs. Kennedy came in. And she came over and stood by the president's head next to Father Huber and across from us, about, again, from here to about there. But I couldn't hear what she said to Father Huber. She spoke in such a low voice. But from the context of his answer, I knew she had asked if the president had received last rites. And Father Huber said to her, and I could hear him say that, he said, yes, I've given him conditional absolution. And so with that, Mrs. Kennedy grimaced. She didn't like to hear that word conditional. But she didn't say anything, and she stood there for a moment more, and then exchanged a ring from her finger to the president's finger, and a ring from his finger to her finger. And stood there a moment again, didn't say anything, then turned and walked down to the end of the gurney the president was lying on, and stood by his bare right foot that was protruding out from underneath the sheet. And she stood there by his foot for a moment, and then leaned over, kissed his foot, and walked out of the room. And that was the last we saw of her ourselves at that time. The next thing that I'm going to describe to you that happened with President Kennedy was told to me by Dr. Rose, who was our forensic pathologist at Parkland at that time. And what happened after the president was pronounced dead, he said, they had brought a coffin out from the O'Neill Funeral Home and put it into Trauma Room 1 onto another gurney that the president was not lying on, and then transferred his body into the coffin onto the other gurney. And they rolled that out of Trauma Room 1 and were rolling it down a long corridor out toward the loading dock. Dr. Rose said he was looking out his office window that faced onto that corridor and saw this little procession with the gurney with the president's body and the coffin on it. And it was preceded by two Secret Service men, one of whom was carrying a Thompson submachine gun. And then Mrs. Kennedy was walking along the left side of the gurney. And then several of the president's close friends, Kenny O'Donnell and Powers, were walking along with him, along with several other men. And when Dr. Rose saw them taking the president out toward the ambulance to take him back to Air Force One, he stepped out into the hall and stepped in front of them and put his hand up and said, I need to ask you to stop because I'm required by law to tell you that anybody that's been murdered in the state of Texas must undergo a post-mortem examination here. Dr. Rose said, with that, nobody said anything to him. They stopped. And he said the Secret Service man, who was unencumbered by the Thompson submachine gun, came over to Dr. Rose, put his hands underneath Dr. Rose's armpits like you would a small child, lifted him up off the ground, off the floor, and placed him over against the wall of the corridor and shook his finger in his face and didn't say anything to him, but it was clear, as Dr. Rose said, that there was going to be no further discussion about that, and so they proceeded out the rear of the hospital to the ambulance and back to Air Force One, and took him back to the Naval Hospital in Washington, where that evening post-mortem exam was done. And that's caused quite a bit of comment as to whether there might have been something done along the way to modify the president's wounds or not. That's a long, whole other story. I might add, incidentally, there have now been more than nearly 3,000 books written about various aspects of the assassination. And it's a whole spectrum of opinion about all kinds of things about that, but very little definitive knowledge yet. So that's what happened there at Parkland that I saw, or that I was told about that evening by Dr. Rose. Now, the next day went by, Saturday, nothing happened.